In the heart of a burning desert, a man was left to die. No water, no contact, not a single soul knew where he was. No hope. Death was only hours away. But then, from the distant horizon, came something no one could have imagined, a herd of wild Mustangs. They didn't flee. They didn't fear. They came forward, like saviors emerging from the wild heart of nature itself. What they did next will make you question everything you thought you knew about animal intelligence, emotion, and compassion. This isn't a fairy tale. This is real. Join us as we witness the miracle that's about to unfold, and it might just change the way you see the world forever. The first breeze of dawn swept softly across Echo Basin, carrying away the last remnants of desert night moisture and revealing a sky so clear it felt almost cold. In this silent stretch of land, where horses would later emerge like something out of myth, the truth behind why Samuel Reeve was left to die in the wilderness began to unfold. Long before hooves carried the breath of a miracle toward him, Samuel was already one with the land. Late spring in Wyoming was unlike anywhere else. Patches of snow still clung to the mountaintops like winter's forgotten memories. Below, sunburnt grasses wrapped around red soil like the cracked skin of the earth itself. The wind in Echo Basin didn't howl, it breathed. Deep, steady breaths scented with pine resin and faint smoke from last year's forest fires. Echo Basin spanned nearly 1 million acres. A place as breathtaking as a painting, but as merciless as nature's final exam. It was home to pronghorn antelope, snowy owls, golden eagles, and most rare of all, the wild Mustangs of the Echo herd, living legends galloping across one of America's last untamed frontiers. They weren't tamed. They weren't owned. Descended from bloodlines nearly erased by time and man, they endured through centuries with toughness, instinct, and an unbreakable will to live. Samuel Reeve didn't come here to conquer nature, he came to listen to it. At 44, Samuel had lived 2 lives. The first, in the city, amid sirens and firestorms, when he was a firefighter in Denver. The second, a quieter, harder, yet more meaningful life, after he left everything behind and became a forest ranger in Echo Basin. He had no wife. No children. No close family, just an old dog named Boone and a weathered pickup that rested like a sentinel outside the ranger station. Samuel didn't speak much, but no one ever doubted the size of his heart. Last year, he had rescued a foal caught in wire near a northern cliff. It was a stormy night, and he spent nearly 4 hours freeing its leg. The foal whimpered but never fought. When it finally rose and limped away, Samuel called it Ashfire, for its eyes that glowed like dying embers refusing to go out. Ashfire never returned. But sometimes, small hoofprints would appear in the sand outside the station, like silent hellos from the wild. The fateful morning began like any other. Samuel checked satellite thermal maps, collected motion sensor data from the forest, then climbed the observation tower with his binoculars. But something felt off. A sparse woodland to the northwest, usually quiet, was showing strange heat patterns, along with unidentified sounds recorded overnight. He grabbed his gear. Flashlight. Survival knife. Radio. 3 bottles of water. No one knew it would be the last time anyone saw him leave the station. The forest seemed still. But as Samuel pushed deeper, he found fresh tire tracks, wide, deep, too heavy for ranger vehicles. Chain treads. Oil. Gasoline. Someone had moved machinery through here. He tried to radio HQ. Nothing. Switched to emergency channel. Silence. A breeze passed. Birdsong stopped. His pulse spiked. The hairs on his neck stood up. If I'm right, someone's stealing from this forest. And I just walked into their den. He drew his knife. Not to fight. Just to be ready. Then, the click of a gun's hammer behind his head. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? A gravel-rough voice spat. Samuel turned, too late. A rifle butt struck his temple, and everything went black. When he came to, they tied him with wire cable to a thick pine. Their faces were blank. Cold. Efficient. Want to play hero, Ranger? Let the wilderness teach you a lesson. The leader sneered. By the time the buzzards find you, there'll be nothing left. They smashed his radio. Emptied his canteens onto the sand. Then vanished, ghost-like, leaving no trace but doom. Samuel had no idea how long he'd been out. Minutes? Hours? When he woke again, the sky had turned copper red, the color of endings. His lips were split wide open. Throat seared. Eyes blistered from sun glare bouncing off pale sand. Every breath scraped like glass. Above, not a single bird. Not a whisper of wind. The world had stopped breathing. This is it, he thought. No one knows where I am. No one's coming. I'll disappear like I never existed. He didn't fight it. The silence hollowed him out until all that remained was surrender. Then, a sound. Not loud. Not clear. But unmistakably real. Hoofbeats. At first it felt like memory playing tricks. But then they grew sharper. Louder. Closer. And in that one fleeting moment of half-life, half-dream, Samuel thought, if this is death, then why do I hear horses in the wind? A strange, tingling sense of urgency crawled through the haze of Samuel's mind. He fought to open his eyes again, desperate to know whether the sound he'd heard was real or just one more cruel hallucination dragging him closer to death. And then, a herd of wild horses appeared. They didn't run. They didn't panic. They advanced cautiously, but without hesitation. Leading them was a striking gray-white stallion, his mane long and unruly, his stance tall and unshakable, like a sculpture carved from clouds and stone. Even from a distance, Samuel could see the cold, intelligent gleam in the horse's eyes, eyes that seemed to have seen far too much of the world. Blizzard. That's what the Rangers had named him. Not because he was white, but because he arrived like a winter storm, unpredictable, unrelenting, and impossible to ignore. The herd stood still, watching Samuel. Not a muscle moved. No one made a sound. And yet, their eyes, every single one, held something no wild animal should possess. They weren't just watching. They were considering. In the fragile space between life and death, Samuel felt as though he were being weighed by a silent tribunal of judges. Without warning, Blizzard let out a low, sharp sound, not loud, but commanding enough that 3 nearby horses immediately moved. They walked toward a shallow depression in the earth near the old juniper where Samuel lay bound. Blizzard led the way, unhurried, as though he already knew this place, as though he had been here before. Then he began to dig. Slowly. Deliberately. Each strike of his hoof was measured and intentional. Dust rose, swirling in the low light, but the stallion didn't falter. A gray horse joined him, clawing at a spot slightly to the west. Then came another, sleek black, with a jagged mane, like he'd once brushed too close to the edge of civilization and survived. No orders. No obvious communication. Yet one by one, they worked in tandem. They were searching for water. Every movement seemed calculated. This wasn't instinct alone, it was as if they carried within them the memory of generations that had learned how to survive the cruelty of the desert. And even half-conscious, Samuel could sense the truth. They knew he was dying of thirst. Then Solace stepped forward. A chestnut mare, soft-eyed and composed, her gaze not blazing like blizzards, but calm, deep, and still, like a spring untouched by wind. She didn't join the digging. She watched. And when Blizzard suddenly paused, lifting his head and stepping aside, she stepped in, graceful, unhurried. She lowered her head, sniffed the soil, then gently scratched at it. A darker patch of earth emerged. Moist. No confirmation was needed. The scent rose, rich and unmistakable. This wasn't a mirage. It wasn't some cruel trick of the heat. It was the unmistakable scent of life. Solace lowered her head again and drank, a small, careful sip. Then, as if aware that even the slightest motion could disturb a sacred moment, she slowly approached Samuel. He couldn't speak. Couldn't lift a hand. All he had were cracked lips and eyes glazed with fever. She stopped. Her warm muzzle pressed gently to his cheek. A breath. Then, a single drop of water slipped from her mouth onto his lips. Samuel could barely comprehend it. It wasn't cold. It wasn't sweet. But it was water. And in that moment, it was the voice of life itself whispering to him. Blizzard approached next. He didn't drink. He simply lowered his head, letting a few drops gather at his lips. Then, just as gently, he stepped toward Samuel and let the droplets fall. Not enough to quench his thirst, but enough to pull him back a step from the edge. Samuel shivered, not from cold, but from something deeper. Wonder. Disbelief. Emotion too large to name. This couldn't be coincidence. It couldn't be animal reflex. One by one, the other horses began to do the same. A dappled horse raised its head from the water and approached with careful steps. An older mare, her ribs visible through a thin coat, nodded once before tilting her face, allowing a thin ribbon of moisture to trail down onto Samuel's wounded arm. No one spoke. No commands were given. But the glances exchanged between them, so fast, so subtle, carried meaning beyond words. A system driven by empathy. Samuel didn't know what he was witnessing. A ritual? A spontaneous reaction? Or a kind of intelligence not yet named by humankind? But one thing was certain. They were not indifferent. Not like the articles claimed. Not like people said about wild horses. They didn't just survive. They observed. They remembered. They made choices. And they had chosen to save him. The sunset stretched the shadows of the echo herd across the sand. Each silhouette fell long and low, like some sacred punctuation between miracle and reality. They didn't leave. They didn't retreat. They remained. A herd of wild horses. A dying man. And something that crossed the ancient boundary of instinct. Like a wilderness rescue team. One that didn't need words. One that didn't need orders. One built on intuition and something even deeper, compassion. Night descended over Echo Basin like a heavy, unforgiving veil. The blistering heat of the day was swept away by the desert's sudden chill, cold that didn't howl, but crept quietly into every muscle, every breath, like a voiceless spirit. Samuel lay motionless. The moisture from the droplets the horses had brought him had long since dried, and a subtle shiver ran from his neck down his spine. The sweat was gone. All that remained was a body, bound to a tree, forgotten in the middle of the wilderness, like a scrap of driftwood stranded on a barren shore. He had no idea how much time he had left. Death didn't approach like a murderer. It came like an old friend, sitting beside him, patiently, unhurried. And then, something even more unbelievable happened. Blizzard was the first to move. He made no sound, didn't look directly at Samuel. He simply lowered himself beside the dying man, close enough that the warmth of his thick coat radiated against Samuel's skin. Then came Solace. And then a small, wiry foal, trailing behind as if it understood exactly what was happening. 3 horses. 3 living bodies. 3 steady hearts beating in rhythm. They laid down, forming a crescent around Samuel like a natural barrier against the creeping dark. Their breath merged into the night, creating a low, steady rhythm. Not one of them stirred. No whinny, no sudden movement. They just laid there. With him. At first, Samuel didn't register what was happening. He thought it was another hallucination. But slowly, gradually, the warmth began to seep into his shoulders, his back, his legs, inch by inch, fighting against the cold tightening around his chest. He couldn't move. But he could feel. Desert nights were rarely forgiving. Usually, there was only the long wait for death. But tonight, the darkness arrived with the heartbeats of three wild creatures, silent yet steady, like loyal guardians watching over his final sleep. Samuel closed his eyes. Not in surrender, but to listen. Inside the blackness, he heard breathing, not just from the horses, but the earth, and perhaps his own. And then, the memories came. He was 6 years old again, back in a snowbound corner of Colorado. His father, a quiet, strong man, had once served as a military veterinarian. The one who'd sparked Samuel's first love for horses. That winter, they found a stray horse, separated from its herd, trapped deep in the snow. His father had wrapped their only blanket around the animal, removed his own coat, and lay beside it, shielding it with his body for 3 hours through the freezing night. By morning, the horse had survived. His father hadn't. Samuel had never forgotten that cold. Nor had he ever forgiven himself for being too small, too weak, too helpless to do anything. He used to wonder, if he had been older, stronger, wiser, would his father have lived? Since that day, he'd avoided winter. Avoided memories. Avoided anything that could thaw the armor around his heart. And now, here in the desert, bound, exposed, without a roof, without a blanket, 3 wild horses were doing what his father had once done. They didn't know the story. But somehow, they were writing its unfinished chapter. He no longer felt the cold. Instead came tears, quiet, unstoppable, unchecked. For the first time in years, Samuel cried. Not from fear of death, but because he no longer felt alone. He had once thought this place would be his grave. But now, nature itself, the very force he had once protected, defended, loved like family, had come back to embrace him. No words needed. No miracle required. Just presence. There was a moment when Samuel vaguely sensed a thin mist rising from his chest, his breath turning to fog, brushing against Blizzard's mane. The horse didn't move. He lifted his head, gazing toward the star-filled sky. And his eyes shimmered something that looked like a promise. Samuel wanted to speak, a thank you, a whisper. But his throat was raw, lips barely parted. And yet, Solace seemed to understand. She lowered her head and gently touched her muzzle to his temple, a response offered without sound. The night wind began to stir again. But Samuel no longer trembled. Wrapped in the invisible shelter of the herd, he could feel each gust diverted, each chill undone by the most honest warmth he had ever known, life given freely, without demand. He wondered, if he survived, would anyone believe him? Would anyone accept that wild animals, creatures long dismissed as purely instinctual, had chosen to shield, protect, and preserve the life of a dying man? Samuel smiled faintly. He didn't need anyone to believe. Because he had lived this moment. He was living. Thanks to the hearts of the wild. The night was still long. But it was no longer lonely. Night slowly gave way to dawn over Echo Basin. The stars above faded, replaced by a pale gray veil as the first light touched the edge of the world. The wind still lingered, sharp, biting, cutting into bone. But within the circle of horse bodies pressed close around Samuel, one thing remained, the warmth of wild life, a fragile shield between him and death. His body no longer shivered. Not because strength had returned, but because feeling had slipped away. Everything blurred, like his mind drifted between two worlds, one of pain and one of dream, where horses whispered and the wind sang lullabies. Then, the strangest thing that night, the last thing he remembered before passing out. Blizzard stood up. Not a whinny. Not a signal. Yet two young horses stood with him. Blizzard turned, looked at Samuel one last time, a look so deep it seemed to pierce through the fog of fading consciousness, and then he bolted. Not in panic. Not in aimless wandering. But like a creature on a mission. The pounding of hooves echoed against the rocky slopes, stirring the earth and sky alike, a windstorm summoned by instinct. Blizzard, along with the two young ones, vanished over the ridge like a silver storm, leaving behind a hushed silence, and the rest of the herd still shielding Samuel. It was as if something greater than survival had called him. Cut to another scene. At the Silver Ridge Ranger Station, about 25 miles west of Echo Basin, morning was barely breaking. A night shift ranger, just swapping out, poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee. Then, clack, clack, clack. Hoofbeats. Close. A long, sharp whinny cut through the air from outside the gate. At first, he thought it was fatigue-induced hallucination. But when he looked through the foggy glass window, his eyes went wide. 3 wild horses. 1 white stallion and 2 colts. Standing just beyond the fence. The white stallion, Blizzard, stomped the earth with force. Then whinnied again, loud and pointed, as if trying to say something. "Chris," the ranger shouted, voice rising in alarm. "There are horses at the fence. But something's off. You have to see this yourself." Chris Martinez, deputy leader of the emergency response team and Samuel's closest friend, rushed out, coffee still steaming in his hand. One glance at the scene and he froze. "No way," he muttered. "That's Echo Herd." "You think it's a signal?" Blizzard whinnied again and turned away. The colts followed. But every few dozen yards, all 3 stopped, looked back, as if checking whether the humans were following. Chris didn't hesitate. "Get the truck. Call the team. Pack emergency gear. I don't care how crazy this sounds, if these horses are showing us the way, we're going." Blizzard led the way like he'd done it 100 times. Every step was deliberate. Every pause calculated. After each bend in the trail, he would stop, glance back at the truck tailing him, then continue. Chris gripped the steering wheel tightly. Red dust swirled outside the windshield. His heart pounded, not from speed, but from instinct. A deep, undeniable knowing that something urgent waited ahead. One team member asked, "You sure about this, Chris? We're really following horses?" Chris didn't look back. "I'm sure of one thing, Samuel's out there. And if this is the only lead we've got, I'm not letting it go." For nearly 15 miles, Blizzard didn't slow down. Only when they crossed a ridge of dry pines did he finally stop, perched on the edge of a slope overlooking Echo Basin. Chris braked hard. The team jumped from the truck, grabbed their gear, and ran down into the valley, following the stallion's gaze. Samuel no longer sensed time. Delirium thickened like fog. In his dreams, he stood on endless plains, no ropes, no thirst, only wind and distant whinnies that called him forward. Suddenly, an engine's roar split the stillness like a blade. Then, voices. "Samuel." It was Chris. Hoarse. Urgent. Desperate. "God. Sam. He's here." Samuel's eyes opened slowly. Everything blurred. But through the morning light, he saw shadows moving toward him, footsteps, voices, the clink of medical supplies. Blizzard stood on the ridge above, still. Watching. He didn't come closer. He didn't flee. Just as Samuel's world began to fade again, he whispered, "They saved me." The rescue team cut the cords, lifted him gently. Water was trickled onto his lips. One medic gasped. He survived on drops of water? And body heat? My God, how is he still alive? Chris looked to the ridge where Blizzard stood, then turned back to his team. No need to ask. We already know. 1 week later, Samuel awoke in a hospital bed. News of his survival had gone nationwide, TV, interviews, headlines. But he didn't care for any of it. All he could think was, were they still out there? And if they were, did they remember him? The days after Samuel's miraculous survival swept across the nation like wildfire. Cable news anchors called it a miracle. Bloggers speculated wildly. A few tabloids even claimed the horses were genetically modified or trained. But within the din of headlines and hashtags, one sentiment echoed louder than any other. Did that really happen? Samuel, still recovering in the hospital, watched it all unfold from his bed with a detached gaze. The world had discovered his story, but few believed it. Not really. The general public was split between awe and skepticism. Experts argued on television about instinct versus coincidence. Scientists dismissed it as projection, humans anthropomorphizing animals yet again. But Samuel knew. He remembered every breath, every drop of water, every whisper of warmth in the desert night. And he knew one more thing. He had to go back. Chris tried to talk him out of it. You almost died, Sam. Hell, you should have died. Why would you want to risk that again? Samuel didn't answer right away. He stared out the hospital window. Spring had arrived. The same wind that once tried to take his life now ruffled the curtains with soft fingers. Because it's not just about survival anymore, he said finally. If they saved me, really saved me, then we have to understand why. How? And if they've done it once, who's to say it hasn't happened before? Chris sighed, already knowing he couldn't stop him. So what? You want to camp out there and wait for them to perform another miracle? Samuel turned. There was steel in his eyes now. No. I want to prove it. And I want the world to see it with their own eyes. 2 months later, Samuel returned to Echo Basin, not as a ranger, but as a researcher. Armed with funding from a private conservation grant and the reluctant support of the Department of Wildlife, he established a small research station at the edge of the basin. But he wasn't doing this alone. Enter Dr. Elara Bloom, an animal behaviorist with a PhD from Stanford and a reputation for chasing the inexplicable. Known for studying primate empathy and crow intelligence, she had never before worked with horses, let alone wild Mustangs. That, she said, was exactly why she came. If what you're saying is even half true, she told Samuel on the first day, we could be looking at a complete paradigm shift in how we understand equine cognition. Maybe even animal empathy itself. She brought sensors, drone cameras, and motion-triggered observation systems. Samuel brought memories, intuition, and a bond with Blizzard that he couldn't explain. Together, they watched. And waited. The first few weeks were quiet. Echo herd stayed at a distance. Elara recorded standard grazing patterns, migration loops, and dominance displays among the stallions. Useful data, but nothing miraculous. Then came the first sign. A group of hikers, separated from their guide, accidentally wandered into a restricted gorge. It was near dusk, and they had no water, no signal, no idea which way was north. 3 hours later, the station's motion sensors picked up movement on the ridge. Blizzard. Not leading his herd. Just watching. Then, he whinnied. Loud. Sharp. Repeated. Is that a warning? Elara muttered. Or Within minutes, 2 rangers were dispatched. They found the hikers huddled near a dry creek bed, less than 100 yards from where Blizzard had stood. The trail the stallion had been on? It ran directly between the gorge and the research station. Coincidence? Maybe. Until it happened again. Next was a fawn caught in a collapsed fence. Its cries were faint, muffled by brush. The camera didn't catch the moment, but Samuel found the hoof prints, clear, deliberate. The herd had circled the area. Dug shallow trenches. Torn at the fencing with hooves and teeth. When the team arrived, the fawn was free, and Blizzard stood watching from the ridge. Again. Elara was stunned. This isn't random. They're responding. They're choosing. She began mapping behaviors, group communication cues, shifts in posture, ear flicks, tail motions, coordinated movement. What emerged wasn't just a hierarchy. It was a network. A language. Over time, the herd stopped avoiding them. Solace, the gentle mare who once shared water with Samuel, was the first to approach within 10 yards of the station. She would stand, silent and still, watching. Other horses followed. Elara captured hours of footage, horses nuzzling injured pack members, shielding young colts from sudden hail, forming circles around coyotes until the predators retreated. They weren't just surviving. They were organizing. Protecting. Learning. What we're seeing, Elara said during a recorded session, is beyond instinct. It's adaptive behavior. It's coordinated. This is the edge of what we thought was possible for ungulates. Samuel nodded. They're not just wild. They're awake. But with attention came doubt. Articles began surfacing. Miracle or myth? Scientists skeptical of Mustang's savior story. Echo herd, smart horses or just smarter marketing? One prominent zoologist dismissed the behavior as accidental conditioning, claiming the horses had simply learned that humans brought food and water. Elara fired back with data. Charts. Comparisons. Neural response studies from equine MRI experiments. But Samuel said it best in an interview with National Geographic. If you still think this is about food or shelter, you weren't there when a wild animal gave you the last of the water it had. The turning point came with a piece of footage caught entirely by accident. A ranger on patrol had left his body cam running when he slipped down a ravine, dislocating his shoulder and cracking his ribs. He activated his beacon, but the signal was weak. What the footage showed, hours later, was Solace standing on a ridge, whinnying toward the sky. Not eating. Not grazing. Calling. 30 minutes later, 2 other horses arrived. They didn't join her. They scattered. One ran west. The other south. When the rescue team finally picked up the weak signal and arrived, the horses were gone. But they traced hoof prints all the way back to the road, where Blizzard had appeared at the same ranger station fence once again. It was the same signal. The same behavior. And this time, it was all on video. By the end of the year, Echo Basin was no longer just a protected zone. It was a question mark drawn in wild dust. A challenge to everything we thought we knew about animal minds. And Samuel, once a lone ranger bound to a tree, now stood as the first bridge between worlds. Human and horse. The doors to the congressional hearing room swung open with a resonant thud. Under the stark white lights resembling a stage, Samuel Reeve stepped in, surrounded by rows of suits, ties, and briefcases. Yet, he wasn't dressed like an activist or a politician. His earth-toned flannel shirt and dusty boots evoked memories of another world, the world of Echo Basin. Hundreds of eyes followed him. In his hand was a hard drive containing evidence. In his heart was a story that could no longer be denied. A senator spoke up, "Mr. Reeve, we've seen the video. We know you have something to say. But remember, this is a scientific and budgetary hearing, not a stage for fairy tales. Samuel nodded, placing the hard drive on the podium. I'm not here to tell fairy tales, sir. I'm here to present evidence. And I hope you'll listen as individuals holding the opportunity to change history. The large screen lit up. Footage played, a barren valley. A man lay unconscious beneath a tree. Surrounding him was a herd of wild horses. Silence filled the room. Only the sound of hooves approaching could be heard. A mare tilted her head, letting water from her mouth drip onto the man's lips. Another lay beside him, sharing warmth. Next scene, 3 horses stood by the ranger station fence, neighing as if urging. Then, the rescue team sped off, following the hoof prints. They saved me, Samuel said as the footage slowed. Not out of instinct, but by choice. Dr. Alara Bloom stepped up next. Data appeared, communication diagrams within the herd, responses to victims, directional signal models, sensor system charts. If this is conditioning, how many millennia would it take to develop such complex reflexes? She asked. We're not witnessing instinct. We're observing an animal community operating with a high level of social organization, capable of learning, empathy, and responding to the suffering of others. A young policy advisor interjected, but is this enough to change national policy? Wild horses currently cost millions annually for holding facilities and reproductive control. Samuel turned back, his gaze unwavering. I'm not suggesting you stop management. I'm suggesting you start learning how to coexist. The final video played. A clip showing horses leading a rescue team to an injured ranger. Weak radio signals. Neighs echoing through the valley. GPS maps confirmed the horse's path matched the rescue team's route. This time, no one voiced opposition. A senator stood up, one who had previously voted to reduce conservation funding. I will propose a 3-year moratorium on wild horse roundups and expand protected areas by 120,000 hectares. We need more research, but clearly, we cannot ignore what's happening. The hearing room buzzed with murmurs. Samuel said nothing more. He didn't need to. The story had spoken for itself. On his way out of the Capitol, a young reporter approached. Do you think the Echo herd understands what you've just done for them? Samuel paused. His eyes distant, as if gazing back at Echo Basin. I don't know if they understand policy. But I do know one thing, the next time I return, they'll be waiting. And he smiled, the first smile since it all began. Early morning in Echo Basin. The mist lay thick like a soft blanket across the wildlands. The sun had yet to break through the cold clouds, and Samuel stood on the observation deck, eyes fixed toward the ridge where the forest sloped down. A full year had passed since the day the horses saved his life. Echo Basin was no longer just a research site. It had become a sanctuary, a place where scientists, students, and nature lovers from around the world came to witness what had once only lived in legend. Samuel was no longer the solitary ranger. Now, he was the guardian of something far greater than himself, a bridge between humanity and nature, built upon hoofbeats and heartbeats. That morning, Samuel noticed strange hoofprints near the path leading to the southern watering hole. Small, uneven, solitary tracks. A foal. He followed the trail into a narrow crevice between the rocks, where he heard labored breathing and the gentle scrape of hooves against stone. There, nestled against the wind, stood Solace, gentle as ever, shielding a small gray foal with wide, frightened eyes. The foal's back left leg was twisted unnaturally. Each attempt to walk sent it collapsing with a soft cry. Samuel crouched down, extending his hand. Solace didn't flinch. She simply watched, as if remembering what Samuel had once done before. "Hey there, little one," he whispered. "You're the next miracle, aren't you?" Samuel set up camp nearby. He didn't move the foal, knowing it would risk severing the bond with the herd. Instead, he brought medicine, bandages, and a makeshift wooden splint. Day after day, he treated the foal. Each morning, Solace would lead her child down to him, steady and patient. Each time he replaced the wrappings, Samuel spoke to the young horse, laying a hand gently on its forehead as if to share his strength. "You're stronger than you know, little one. Just like your mother. Just like the whole herd." The foal grew used to his presence. It no longer trembled at his touch. The swelling eased. The crooked leg began to straighten, slowly but surely. And one crisp autumn morning, the foal stood, unaided, for the very first time. The day that foal took its first steps, the entire station erupted in celebration. Scientists recorded the moment. Students applauded. And Samuel, he just stood silently, tears in his eyes. "We need to name it," Alara said, standing beside him. Samuel nodded. He gazed toward the rising sun, its light gleaming off the foal's mane as it galloped through golden grass. "Haven," he said. "Because no matter how harsh the world, it chose to live. And to live beautifully." Haven grew swiftly. He learned to cross streams, avoid landslides, and even guide younger foals back to the herd when they wandered too far. But what set Haven apart wasn't just his recovery. It was his gaze. Calm. Deep. A gaze that carried something from Solace, from Samuel, from the very soul of Echo Basin. Once, a young boy visiting the sanctuary stood silently for over an hour, just watching Haven graze. When his mother asked why, he simply said, "I think he knows I'm sad." Haven wasn't just a rescued foal. He was a symbol of a new generation, one where humans and the wild didn't just coexist, but healed one another. Legacy isn't what we leave behind when we die. It's what we pass forward, through action, through kindness, through believing in the impossible. Samuel placed a hand over his heart, where the old scar still pulsed faintly. He watched as the echo herd disappeared behind the ridge. At the front, Haven led the way, a new flame, carrying the message of an entire journey. Live. Believe. And leave the world better than you found it. 5 years later. Echo Basin had a new name now, Echo Haven. The sanctuary had expanded into a full learning and conservation center. Children came on school buses. University researchers pitched tents for long-term studies. Visitors from around the world walked the trail Samuel once patrolled alone. And at the heart of it all was a single tower, an old fire lookout, rebuilt with timber and glass. Samuel stood there every morning with a cup of coffee, watching the mists roll away. Some mornings, blizzard still returned. Older now. Wiser. His bony silhouette cresting the same ridges, followed by Solace, Haven, and an ever-growing herd. They always paused, just for a moment, as if checking to make sure the humans still remembered. Samuel always waved. And every time, he whispered, "Thank you." People used to ask him if he believed it was a miracle. He no longer used that word. Not because it wasn't beautiful, but because what happened wasn't a gift from the divine. It was something older, more grounded, and infinitely more reachable. When you have nothing left, he often told students, and nature still opens its arms to you, that's not a miracle. That's a reminder, we are never truly alone. And maybe that's the message we all needed. If this story touched your heart, let us know below. Share your thoughts in the comments, your favorite moment, your interpretation of the bond between human and horse. Like, share this video to spread the message of compassion across species. And don't forget to subscribe to Gallop of Glory for more real-life stories where the wild world heals, teaches, and transforms us all. See you next time, where the wind still carries whispers of hoofbeats through the canyon. Until then, stay kind, stay wild, and stay believing.